Well, welcome everybody. My name's Chris Burkett. I teach political science and history here at Ashland University, and I'm also the director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program, which is a program for undergraduate students interested in studying serious things about politics and history, among other things. A lot of our Ashbrook scholars major in all sorts of different things, but they have a kind of common interest and love for studying or thinking about history and politics and government. So we're here tonight to talk about Frederick Douglass's Oration, right, in memory of Abraham Lincoln, which is a really great speech, one of Douglass's finest among many good speeches. So I think I'm not sure if everybody's been to these before. If this is your first time to one of these, the point is to just have hopefully a thoughtful, lively conversation about an important text, an important document. Feel free to jump in at any point with thoughts or questions as we try to help each other understand Douglass's speech better and think through this together. So just feel free jumping into the conversation at any point. If you like, you can raise the hand. You have a hand button you can push and raise the hand, and I'll call on you. But there's no need for the hand. If you want to just jump in, please feel free to do so. So, all right. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at this, or you've read it before. As I said, this is a really tremendous speech, very carefully written, very thoughtfully written, given especially given the occasion for the speech, which was a very important occasion to Frederick Douglass. So very carefully crafted speech in light of that. So let's begin at the beginning. This is just such a great, fun speech to read out loud. Why don't we start at the beginning and maybe read the first 3 paragraphs or so to get a sense of Douglass's style of writing and to figure out what his point is here. What is he writing about? Does anybody want to read? This is something we do in our undergraduate classes a lot. We read out loud. It's a very good thing to do for a number of reasons. Anybody want to read? Hey, go right ahead. Who was that? Grace?
Yes, Grace. So just start from the friends and fellow citizens part.
Perfect.
Okay. Friends and fellow citizens, I warmly congratulate you upon the highly interesting object which has caused you to assemble in such numbers and spirit as you have today. This occasion is in some respects remarkable. Wise and thoughtful men of our race, who shall come after us, and study the lesson of our history in the United States, who shall survey the long and dreary spaces over which we have traveled, who shall count the links in the great chain of events by which we have reached our present position, will make a note of this occasion. They will think of it and speak of it with a sense of mainly pride and complacency.
Yeah, good. Grace, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Good. Thanks. Let's pause there for a second. Good job. So, to whom is Douglass speaking? Anybody?
Well, he starts off by saying friends and fellow citizens, so I'm guessing a crowd.
It's a crowd. Yeah, this is a live audience speech. So all we know so far is he's speaking to friends and fellow citizens, right? But he begins these first 2 paragraphs by talking about you. He's talking about somebody in particular, right? And addressing them directly. We don't quite know who yet, but if we keep reading, I'm sure. Hey, Carolina, yeah, go right ahead, please. Hey.
I think specifically he's speaking to African Americans.
Yeah, he is.
Those gathered there.
Yeah. What gave you? Was there something in this paragraph, or just you've read it before that gave you a sense that he's?
When I read through it, I believe it's like 3 paragraphs down, he says, "In view then of the past, the present, and the future, with the long and dark history of our bondage behind us." Well, he refers to bondage, so.
But we don't know that until what paragraph is that? The third? Did you say 3rd paragraph?
I believe it's the 4th paragraph. It's right at the end.
So we don't know that, right, until we get into the speech a little bit.
Also in the first paragraph, then he's like, wise and thoughtful men of our race. So like humanity isn't a race. Like Americans are not part of like a single race. They're like a species, right? Humans are a species. So like that's kind of like he's talking about the African American.
Yeah, could be that too, Nicholas. Yeah, although I think you're right about that, but it is not uncommon to see people back then use the term race to refer to the human race. But you're right. Generally, today we think of race differently and we tend to use the term species, right? So, so he still could be speaking of the human race there, wise and thoughtful men of our race. Okay, but he does use the term race. All right, good. So, it's a momentous occasion, right? So he's there initially congratulating the you, whoever the you is, right? It's an important occasion, and many people will take note of it and will speak of it with a sense of manly pride, right? You want to keep reading, Grace? See why
Sure.
why he's another reason he's congratulating the you, which is I think the Black Americans in the audience, as Carolina points out.
I congratulate you also upon the very favorable circumstances in which we meet today. They are high, inspiring, and uncommon. They lend grace, glory, and significance to the object for which we have met. Nowhere else in this great country, with its uncounted towns and cities, unlimited wealth, and immeasurable territory extending from sea to sea, could conditions be found more favorable to the success of this occasion than here.
Okay, so the second thing he says about this occasion, and he still hasn't said what the occasion is, right? But the second thing he says here is that this is a high and noble occasion, right? What we're doing is a high thing, a very important thing, right? And that's another reason he congratulates the you to whom he is speaking, right? The Black Americans in the audience. So, third paragraph, one more paragraph, if you don't mind, Grace.
Of course.
We stand today.
We stand today at the National Center to perform something like a national act, an act which is to go into history. And we are here where every pulsation of the national heart can be heard, felt, and reciprocated. 1,000 wires fed with thought and winged with lightning put us in instantaneous communication with the loyal and true men all over the country.
All right. So now we know where, all right? The speech is being given. Where's the speech being given?
The center of the country.
So, well, he calls it the National Center, right? So, what is it?
Maybe like Washington.
Yeah, it's Washington. Yeah, not Iowa, but which was like in the center of the country, or maybe North Dakota or something, or Kansas, but yeah, Washington D.C. in the National Center. Why does he emphasize that we're in the National Center? What is it about the act that makes it significant that they're doing this in the capital, the center of the nation?
I think this suggests both that their position as citizens is legitimized because they can gather in the nation's center as citizens, and also that they're unified as one nation.
Yeah,
one
is this Joseph?
This is Joseph. Thank you.
Hey, Joseph. Yeah, I can't see you. I can just see your JMC London. But yeah, so you mentioned two things. And Douglas points this out as well, doesn't he? I mean, this is the first time we've been able to participate in something like this. If you skip down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th paragraph. We should have numbered our paragraphs before we started. For the first time in the history of our people and in the history of the whole American people, we join in this high worship and march conspicuously in the line of this time-honored custom. So this is the first time that something like this has happened for Black Americans, that they've been either able to or allowed to participate in something like this, right?
Yes.
But the second part, I think, is the part he really is emphasizing, Joseph, where you say it's about union. Why do you say it's about union? What does he say that makes you think it's about unions?
In general, I was just thinking of the rhetorical significance of emphasizing meeting in the Capitol but he also mentions meeting in the most luminous point of American territory
Yeah.
in paragraph 6, and mentions that the city was recently transformed and made beautiful in body and spirit. And when I think of the biblical significance of this, if there are any biblical allusions, it would suggest that the body is healthy with all its members united.
Right. Nice. Yeah. So, but what body is united here in the metaphor, so to speak, that Douglas is emphasizing
Certainly,
here? Go ahead, please. Joseph or anybody, please.
certainly African Americans. And I haven't seen evidence that white people are here, but I think that's quite likely as well.
And they were, in fact, some there. But at no point in the speech does he address them directly, interestingly enough. This is all directed to Black Americans, African, and this is like a conversation among them, even though there are white Americans listening to the speech at the time, interestingly enough. So when he says we stand at the National Center to perform something like a national act, that's really important, I think, because it reflects something of this unity, Joseph, that you were pointing out, right?
Yes.
Also, that maybe for the first time, this people is actually part of the nation, right? The African American, Black Americans are now capable of performing an act that is national in character, right? Or somehow um, on behalf of the nation, right? In a certain sense.
Definitely. In paragraph 5, he also mentions the new dispensation of freedom with its blessings
Yes.
to both races.
Right.
Then, yeah, and then he congratulates all, which I'm assuming to be everyone, white and black, upon the contrast between now and then. And that's roughly paraphrased.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. Very nice. So again, first time we're able to participate in something like a national act, even though it's not an official act of Congress or something like that, right? But it is an act by Black Americans. But again, he hasn't said what we're doing here yet, right? But it is an act by Black Americans as part of the nation for the first time. And let's not overlook the obvious here, right? There are a wide range of disagreements among both white and Black Americans at the time as to whether or not um, uh, Black Americans should want to be Americans, right? You already have, by the way, the growth. This is in 1876. You just came out of a period when quite a few white Americans, even those sympathetic to the cause of ending slavery, right, even abolitionists, had in mind the idea that blacks should leave the country after emancipation and become citizens of some other land, right, through colonization or expatriation or something else. And among the Black community already, you have some disagreement as to whether or not blacks want to call this their country, this their nation, or should they leave and go somewhere else and start over, right? But
Yes.
in this is a really important political statement by Douglas here to an audience of Black Americans, in which he is emphasizing in his mind the fact that they are in fact Americans and part of this country. This is their country. And so when we engage in something like a national act, it's not, they're not just there to, do the particular thing that they're going to do, right? Which is to dedicate a monument, which is called the Freedmen's Monument in Washington, D.C., if anybody's ever seen it. And also to praise Abraham Lincoln or to the extent that he deserves praise, right, for his role in ending slavery. But Douglas has another purpose. He wants to emphasize the fact that blacks should think of their country, okay? And so the symbolism of this act extends to that for Douglas. Joseph, did you want to jump in? I thought somebody else wanted to jump in. No? Like I thought somebody wanted to jump in. I apologize if I cut you off. All right. So again, we're there to see. Has anybody seen this monument, by the way, the Freedmen's Monument? In DC, you can still see it. It's still there. By the way, it was not Frederick Douglass was not a big admirer of the statue, of the sculpture, the monument. It's a statue of Abraham Lincoln standing over a slave who has he's standing over a slave that's bent over, and his chains of manacles have been broken, right? Yeah, Eric says kind of white supremacist. I mean, that's kind of the view Douglas had, right? Yeah, because Lincoln's bending over the slave, right? And it's unclear from the sculpture whether the slave is rising on his own power or whether he's being lifted somehow to freedom by Lincoln. And Douglas, of course, always insisted that if there was hope for Black Americans, the future for Black Americans rested entirely on their ability to rise by their own power, right? To the level of.
I was wondering if I could jump in real quick.
Please, yeah, go right ahead.
So after reading his writings, it seems that the African Americans gathered together and they funded the creation of this statue.
He did.
So it's just, I mean, it seems like they didn't really have a say in the statue itself, because at least Frederick Douglass wasn't very happy with how African Americans were portrayed. So that's a pretty big shame. I mean, they paid for it, but they don't get to choose what it looks like.
Well, and see there again, all these ironies involved, right? I mean, this is a great point, Caroline. They're there to celebrate. They're there on the anniversary of Lincoln's death, right? Or roughly 10 years later after his death, 11 years actually. So he's gonna speak about Lincoln, but they're there celebrating the dedication of this monument to the end of slavery, right? And but even the well, what am I trying to say? Yeah, there's some ironies here because this is really how do I do this? You said it better than I'm struggling for some reason. Douglas wanted this to be this entire act to be done, carried out, executed by the Black community itself. So we could say it is purely an act done by a community that was just a decade before thought incapable of doing something like this. And yet you have the problem of the statue, the sculpture, right? Yeah. And there are other little problems going. But the irony is, again, it's very foreshadowing in a way, if that's the right word, about the problems facing Black Americans for the next, well, at least 4 to 5 decades into the early 1900s. And that is, the question is, do Black Americans, former slaves especially, need the help of whites to rise to a level of equality, or should they be left on their own to do these things by their own powers, by the means of their own choosing? So the statue becomes the sculpture becomes very sort of polarizing, but also very symbolic. Is the slave rising of his own power, or is he being helped up by, in this case, Lincoln, but a white man? And if you skip ahead to the debates in the 1890s, early 1900s between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, you see how that debate really plays out among the Black community. I'm sorry, go right ahead. Mrs. Richmond, did you want to jump in?
I had a little comment. I think one thing about the statue, of the way that the African man is portrayed, is that he looks very much like those earlier prints that were so big in the abolitionist movement of "Am I not a man and a brother?" It's very much like that. The slave in a loincloth, basically, naked except for a little loincloth,
right.
Crouching and kneeling. It's very much like that image. So, for some people it would resonate with that this is the abolitionist movement. But yeah, it's, there weren't too many slaves who were ever wearing loincloths.
Yeah.
At this time. And
good point.
It is interesting, though. I did find out that the man who was used as the model for the Black man was a particular man. His name was Alexander Archer, and he was the last Black man captured under the Fugitive Slave Act.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's amazing. Oh,
Pretty
that's
powerful.
yeah, it is powerful. Yeah, and just a quick comment on your really good point, Mrs. Richmond. The pose was the pose was not intended to be divisive. It was, I'm sure many people, especially among abolitionists, for the reasons you mentioned, thought it was harmless, right? I mean, but it just smacked a little bit in the mind, and like for Frederick Douglass and some others, it's a little condescending, and that's always the challenge, right? I mean, to what extent do we need help from the white community? But you know, I mean, it's not a bad. We don't hate them or blame them because they want to help, but you know, unless we do this ourselves, the argument goes, then there'll always be that shadow of the, you know, hanging over us that we couldn't do it ourselves, and so the fear was that even even in the course of rising to the level of equality, the mode by which it is accomplished if you say that it can only be accomplished with the help of the white man, in a way it implies a kind of inferiority, right, and superiority. So again, yeah, again, but that Douglas, you know, he didn't ruin the occasion. He was a good sport and didn't he didn't let it sidetrack him from his main purpose here, which was to again, as Joseph said, unify the Black community and on this occasion around the memory of Abraham Lincoln. Hey, Malena, please go right ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Richmond, go ahead, please.
A couple of other things. There were very prominent white people there.
Yes.
President Grant was present.
Mhm.
There were members of the cabinet, senators, and even some Supreme Court justices, which I've always thought, whoa, instead of having Tawney, who did the Dred Scott decision, now they've got the new Supreme Court justices.
Right.
Tawney's now dead. So it's kind of shows the changes.
It's a very important point. Good, but yes. And this is a very widely attended, a lot of people were there, and a lot of very important people as well, right? Which again, it just makes it even more striking to me that the tone throughout the whole speech is Douglas speaking to Black Americans, right? And really not talking to the white, even Supreme Court justices and congressmen and the president in the audience. He's not speaking to them directly. And again, it's part of his larger purpose of I think galvanizing or building this kind of unity among Black Americans as Blacks, of course, but also as part of this country. So
fellow citizens, you know, the thing that they were told they could never be, now they are.
Yeah, and I'm struck by this even more. This is a little bit of a digression. I apologize, but I'm struck by this even more because I just heard we just had a speaker. We have speakers come to campus to speak with our Ashbrook scholars 6 times a year to give some interesting talk. And Lucas Morel came, and he's a very well-known scholar on Abraham Lincoln. And Frederick Douglass came and gave a talk about Malcolm X. If you know anything about Malcolm X in the 1960s, Malcolm X was making exactly the opposite argument, right? That is, that Blacks ought to give up on thinking of themselves as part of this community or being part of this country, because all it does is keep them down, and the cards are stacked against them, and so I heard a great talk on Friday about Malcolm X's arguments almost a century later, right? About why we shouldn't do this, but here Douglas is making the opposite point, right? This is our country, so we can be, and I think it's an important, again, not to overlook the obvious here. He is saying we can be Black, right? He never says we need to be white. We can be Black and be part of this country. We can be both. Which again, I think there's a lot in this speech where Douglas is trying to set the tone for how Black Americans as a community think about themselves moving forward. And Douglas is the one who's really establishing that tone. So I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but I think it's Malena. I hope I'm pronouncing it.
Malena. Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
I thought the point about whether or not the sculptor had the right intentions and whether or not the statue is condescending is interesting, because I think it has a lot of parallels to present day, because now we hear a lot of talk about like, oh, don't be a white savior, don't try and be a white savior in this instance, and we use that term to refer to somebody who's honestly trying to do good, but isn't educated on the issues and maybe doesn't share a complete understanding of why there's whatever oppression there is that this person is trying to fight. And so I think it's interesting to see how we still see these debates play out today, in a variety of different forums.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a great point, Melena. The seeds of a lot of the discourse we continue to have in this country over race are all right in there, right? Somehow. They all sort of, a lot of them are in this speech. At least they start to reveal themselves in this speech. So I think that's a really, really important point. And again, for Douglas, this is an important question because, well, for one, by the way, on your point about the term, being a white savior, more contemporary term, for the past decade under Reconstruction, Black Americans had seen a lot more harm done than good in some cases, right? In attempts by white Americans to help them get ahead, right? I mean, right? At the end of the war, was it who was the general? I'm drawing a blank. Mrs. Richmond, you might know this. The general who, in order to help keep or help, who was it? Was it Butler? Sorry, I blanked. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Oh, who's the general though who put slaves to work? I mean, they're free, but they need to. But in order to prepare them for freedom, he assigned them tasks. He essentially re-enslaved them. This is a Union general, and gave everybody a task to do, and kept them busy, right, for a couple of years, all in the name of helping them. But essentially, I mean, it was totally degrading. So sometimes these things happen. But for Douglas, I think the higher importance here is to say that Blacks are equally capable of whites of vindicating the idea of liberty and self-government. For Douglas, it's a matter of real principle. There's a practical consideration here. But Douglas wanted to prove that liberty, that human beings, including Black human beings, are capable of exercising liberty, being free, and exercising that freedom well, equally as well, right, with people of other races. That's the high principle at stake here for Douglas. So he's got to really emphasize these things, the we, right, throughout the speech. When he talks to his fellow citizens, and he talks about we here for the first time do this, and we're doing this, and we do this. He's really emphasizing that the importance of that to his particular audience of Black Americans. Okay, good. So what is it we're going to do today then? We talked about he's dedicating, they're there to dedicate the monument, right? The Freedmen's Monument, which includes Abraham Lincoln in the background. And Douglas takes this opportunity to talk on the occasion of Lincoln's assassination, the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, about Lincoln himself, right? So he begins to talk about him on page, well, you probably don't have the same page numbers that I do. I'm looking at this part of the speech where the paragraph begins, fellow citizens, in what we have said and done today, and in what we may say and do hereafter, we disclaim everything like arrogance and assumption. We claim, did everybody find this part of the speech? We claim for ourselves, and again, he's talking to other, the crowd of Black Americans. We Blacks claim for ourselves no superior devotion to the character, history, and memory of the illustrious name whose monument we have here dedicated today. So again, notice, what does that sound like to you when he says that? When he says we disclaim everything like arrogance and claim for ourselves no superior devotion to Abraham Lincoln. What's that sound like? What is he?
I think that he's first acknowledging differences in perceptions of the leader, both the Black and white communities, because
Okay.
the Blacks see him as a savior and a person who fought for their civil rights. The white people might see him as a war hero, but less of a savior.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's great. Douglas is going to work through those different views, right? Those different perceptions of Lincoln. That's good. So, but here he's saying we, and again, Douglas is speaking on behalf. He's not just speaking himself, but when he says we, he is now speaking on behalf of all of the Black Americans in the audience, right? And what does he say? It's not arrogance on our part to speak on Abraham Lincoln. It just strikes me as odd that he feels compelled to say that it's not arrogance on the part of a Black man when he speaks of Abraham Lincoln. And he goes on, he says, we claim for ourselves no superior devotion to the character. So what is so, but here he's saying we, and again, Douglas is speaking on behalf, he's not just speaking himself, but when he says we, he is now speaking on behalf of all of the Black Americans in the audience, right? And what does he say? It's not arrogance on our part to speak on Abraham Lincoln. It just strikes me as odd that he feels compelled to say that it's not arrogance on the part of a Black man when he speaks of Abraham Lincoln. And he goes on, he says, we claim for ourselves no superior devotion to the character. So what is this emphasizing when he says it's not arrogant for us to speak of Abraham Lincoln, nor do we claim to have some superior devotion to him than whom? Than whites, right? So go ahead, please.
My first thought was cynical, but it was that large gathering of Black people in Washington, D.C. would be unprecedented, and it could raise fears that the African American freedmen are going to unlawfully or unfairly use their new citizenship. So I thought that perhaps the broader suggestion is that they're exercising their civil rights in a perfectly legitimate way.
Yeah, that's a really subtle point, I think, that's in here, right? So first he says, we disclaim anything like arrogance. Because some people might say, well, how dare you slaves, right? You Black Americans who just 10 years ago were so degraded, right? in slavery. It would be arrogant on your behalf to gather here and do this thing that you're doing and claim that you actually know something about Abraham Lincoln, right? What arrogance. But Douglas says, no, that's not arrogance. So in the one sense, in that first sentence, he is insisting on the equal right and ability of Black Americans to speak, to know and think about Abraham Lincoln, right? But then he goes on, he says, but that doesn't make us superior to whites or non-Blacks, right, in our devotion to Lincoln, right? So in the first sentence, he demands a kind of equality, but in the very next sentence, asserts equality in a different way, right? By saying our devotion is not unequal, it's not greater or better to Lincoln than the devotion whites have. But as Joseph, as you pointed out, it is different, right? As he'll go on and say. Our devotion is very different. It's not superior, but it's different. Why is it different? Because we have a different perspective on Lincoln. We love him, right? Why? Because as Douglas said earlier, just in the previous paragraph, he's the first martyr president of the United States. He calls him the first martyr president. I find it interesting, right? Why was Lincoln a martyr president? What's a martyr? Everybody knows what a martyr is, I hope.
He was a martyr because he died for a cause.
Yeah. And what was the cause?
And the cause, I think Douglas is saying that the cause was the freedom of African American people.
Well, that would be the perspective or the basis of the devotion that African Americans have for Lincoln, right? What would whites might say?
Yeah.
He died for a cause. But was it for freedom? Was it for the freedom of African slaves, or was it for?
They would say that he died for the Union.
Yeah. See, so right at the beginning, toward the beginning, he says he's a martyr, right? He's the first martyr president. He died for a cause, but he doesn't say what the cause was. So he is then going to go through this speech and speak about Lincoln and what Lincoln thought he was doing in the Civil War, why he thought he was doing what he was doing, right? And why he ultimately died. But he's going to present this from two different perspectives, which is really remarkable.
I wonder if I could jump in. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Is it Lee?
Yeah,
Right.
Lee. Hi. I'm looking at this paragraph that we were discussing that starts with fellow citizens and what we have said and done today. And we were talking about the decision that Douglas feels he has to make between Meaning that these African Americans have a right to be there today. It is not arrogance. But reading further down the paragraph, he writes, I think it's the last sentence that he writes, it must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his associations, in his habits of thought, and his prejudices, he was a white man. And I find it really interesting that he's still, in the same paragraph as making the distinction that yes, they do have a right to be there. He's also still making the distinction that there's a great deal of separation still, which is to be just really interesting to see.
No, this is great, Lee. Thank you. This is really where, to me, it gets really interesting, because up to this point, it's been about black unity, but as members of a larger union, right? We're all part of the same country. And we agree so far that Lincoln was a martyr president. But then, as you point out, to begin to speak about Lincoln, the reason he's there today to speak, right, about Lincoln, he begins by saying, "I've got to be honest," right? Why does he have to be honest, by the way? Why does he have to speak the truth, or why does he feel compelled to say this?
I think he feels the need to be honest so that he doesn't, misrepresent Lincoln and try to, look at only the good and not the bad.
Yeah. He says, right, truth is proper and beautiful at all times and in all places. And it is never more proper and beautiful in any case than when speaking of a great public man, right, like Lincoln. So he goes on, Lee, as you point out, and he says, we have to say, truthful here. He was a white man, right, with the same prejudices of his fellow white men, right? And he was not our man or our model. So he says, truth compels me to say that. Why? How did you put it, Eric? So he doesn't misrepresent Lincoln? Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah.
But I also think perhaps, go ahead, please, Joseph.
Thank you. I think Douglas knows that it's also to the benefit of African Americans to be truthful about the issue rather than to subscribe to white narratives about President Lincoln.
Yeah.
Because
that's a good point. Good. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
Thank you. Because African Americans won their freedom by being truthful about the situation. So continuing to believe false narratives won't get them anywhere with civil rights.
Yeah, right. I mean, building up myths, right? If you build up, we all know the danger. Sometimes myths, social myths, or societal myths are useful, but if you build a society on myths, what happens when the myth is proven to be false, right? Your society collapse. I'm thinking of ancient examples now, the Roman and Greek times, but these are great points. I will throw out one more, and I'll just ask a question: what was Abraham Lincoln's nickname?
Honest
You know what
Abe.
everybody calls him, right? Honest Abe. Yeah, Abe. I saw that, Lee. Honest. So honesty is suitable. Only honesty is suitable when speaking of a man who himself believed that honesty was so important, right? So it's like, out of respect to Lincoln, we have to be truthful here. We have to be honest about things. Anything less than that would be disrespectful to Lincoln, who was himself a man who loved truth. So, Lee, you point out, boom, Lincoln says he was, in the fullest sense of the word, either a man or a model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. And he goes on, and you can just again picture this crowd, right, with these throngs of Black Americans listening to Douglas speak, and sort of on the fringes, mostly on the fringes of the audience, is the white crowd. And Douglas is speaking directly at the Black audience here, telling them Lincoln was the white man's president. Very next paragraph. So Douglas begins by saying, here's how white people think about Lincoln. Right? White people, black people, white Americans, black Americans all agree Lincoln was a martyr president. He died for a cause, but they disagree on what his motives were, what he was doing, why he was doing, how he was doing it. Right? They have these totally different perspectives. So let's look at the white perspective. Anybody want to read this paragraph? He was preeminently the white man's president. Notice he doesn't say only the white man's president. He just says preeminently. Go ahead. Anybody want to read?
You
I
can
can
read.
give it a shot. Oh, my bad.
Never mind, Carolina, you can do it.
Okay, cool. So, he was preeminently the white man's president, either entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. In all his education and feeling, he was an American of the Americans. He came into the presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely, opposition to the extension of slavery. His arguments in furtherance of this policy and their motive and mainspring in his patriotic devotion to the interests of his own race, to protect, defend, and perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed. Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. Oh my God.
Sure, that's great.
I'm sorry, like my screen blacked out. Am I still on?
Can you hear me? I can hear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, everything just went black, but I can continue reading.
Oh, good. Do you mind? Yeah, just a little bit further. Thanks.
Okay, I believe I was at to draw the sword of the nation. Okay.
To
He was
protect,
ready.
defend.
Okay, to protect, defend, and
Oh, you're
perpetuate slavery in the states where it existed. Abraham Lincoln was not less ready than any other president to draw the sword of the nation. He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, and to suppress a slave rising for liberty, though his guilty master were already in arms against the government. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship, at once full and supreme. First, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. To
Okay,
you it is,
Caroline, let's
yeah,
pause for
okay.
this. Yeah, thank you. Good. He goes on in the rest of this paragraph, and by the way, this is the only time he speaks directly to the white Americans in the audience. When he is saying Lincoln was your president, right? And he goes on in this paragraph and says to white Americans in the audience, "This is why you should be building monuments to Lincoln, right? You should be erecting statues. You should hang his pictures everywhere, and so on and so forth, right? You white Americans should be the ones singing Lincoln's praises constantly." So it's really interesting that he ends up one paragraph speaking directly to them. Now, so what do you make of that paragraph that Carolina read?
Well, I think it's making a point out of Lincoln prioritizing white Americans over black Americans, preserving the Union over doing what was, morally right, and emancipation and abolition of slavery.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of in line with the previous criticism of Lincoln and saying that he's not entirely someone who was devoted to the abolition of slavery above all else.
Yeah. So by the way, this is good, Eric. So thanks. In that paragraph that Carolina just read, almost all of that's true. For some of the reasons you were just mentioning, Eric. I mean, I'm hard pressed to find something here that I can say Douglas is wrong about. At least from a certain perspective, again, right? The first years of his administration, he was willing to sacrifice the rights of humanity in the people to promote the welfare of the white people of his country. So, like, what sorts of things is he talking about? Why didn't Lincoln for the abolition of slavery when he became president, right? As Aspen says, right? He wanted to save the Union. As commander in chief, as president of the United States, he took an oath to defend, right, and preserve the Constitution and the Union. So his first, Lincoln understood that his most immediate job was to defend the Union, right? So that meant, as president, other things had to be second to that. If you couldn't have both, if you couldn't both end slavery and preserve the Union, you have to choose preserving the Union. It's your constitutional obligation as president, right? True, he did run as a Republican, and the principle of the Republican Party was not to end slavery, but to prevent the expansion of slavery. And this is the thing Lincoln spoke most frequently on in his political career before he was elected president, right? He was even willing to defend the constitutional rights of states, or the right of states, I should say, to have slaves where it existed. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I think Lincoln, not Lincoln, my bad. I think Frederick Douglass was incredibly bold in having so much of this speech dedicated to all the wrongs that Lincoln in some ways carried out against Black people, but then to turn around and say, despite all of this, I'm going to prove to you why we should still commemorate him and honor him.
Yeah.
Like, and he manages to do it successfully. So it just, I guess it's a testament to Frederick Douglass's ability to get his points across, because he does both very well.
Yeah, I mean, look, he sets himself up for a huge challenge, right? If his challenge is to redeem Lincoln's reputation in the end, in the eyes of everybody, white Americans and Black Americans, he's setting himself up, as you would think, for failure here, right? He's setting a high task for himself, because he's going to have to prove that despite these things, as you say, Carolina, despite these things, Lincoln is still worthy of our admiration, our deepest admiration, right? So yeah, I mean, this is partly what makes this such a great speech, and Douglass such a great speechwriter and thinker, is that he can pull something like this off in this speech. So, by the way, again, this mostly again from the white perspective, though. These were the things that most white Northerners, anyway, right, who remained loyal to the Union, expected Lincoln to do, right? Not slavery where it existed in the States, do everything necessary to preserve the Union, but otherwise not push for the abolition of slavery. These are the things most white Northerners expected Lincoln to do in his first 2 years in office. And he did them, right? He even continued to enforce fugitive slave law like that, right? Why? Because it's their laws, and his job is to execute the laws. So, but now we got to keep going, good, because we got to get to the redeeming part, as Carolina says, right? So, what is it redeeming, right? Now, let's turn and look at how we Black Americans viewed Lincoln from our lowly position, right? Our lowest position. The paragraph right after the one that Carolina was reading. Fellow citizens, again, ours is no newborn zeal and devotion. Anybody want to read this? Anybody else want to read?
Read it.
Please go right ahead.
Okay. Fellow citizens, ours is no newborn zeal and devotion, merely a thing of this moment. The name of Abraham Lincoln was near and dear to our hearts in the darkest and most perilous hours of the Republic. We were no more ashamed of him when shrouded in clouds of darkness, of doubt and defeat, than when we saw him crowned with victory, honor, and glory. Our faith in him was often taxed and strained to the uttermost, but it never failed. When he tarried long in the mountain, when he strange...
Sorry to interrupt, but just point, great biblical reference, right?
Yeah.
Tarrying in the mountain. Go ahead, keep going.
Okay. When he tarried long in the mountain, when he strangely told us that we were the cause of the war, when he still more strangely told us that we were to leave the land in which we were born, when he refused to employ our arms in defense of the Union, when after accepting our services as colored soldiers, he refused to retaliate our murder and torture it as colored prisoners, when he told us he would save the Union if he could with slavery, when he revoked the proclamation of Emancipation of General Fremont, when he refused to remove the popular commander of the Army of the Potomac in the days of its inaction and defeat? Who was more zealous in his efforts to protect slavery than to suppress rebellion? When we saw all this and more, we were at times grieved, stunned, and greatly bewildered, but our hearts believed while they ached and bled.
Can we pause
Nor
for a
was
second?
this-
We pause for a second. So this is how Black Americans from their darkest moments, right, in their darkest moments, looked at Lincoln and thought of Lincoln. So how did they think of him, even in their darkest times, in their darkest moments, the darkest and most perilous hours?
It seems like, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Sasha, please.
Okay. It seems like he's trying to say that they were weirdly dependent on him. Like they were cautious, that they hoped that he could or would help them, but that they weren't sure that he would, which is kind of odd, being that he's trying to show the Black man as being strong in this speech.
Yeah. So what's the evidence? So by the way, everything they notice here would cause them to doubt Lincoln, right? He tarried in, right? He's slow moving. He doesn't do anything quickly, right? People are saying issue Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln says no, can't do it. No constitutional authority. He rescinds other Emancipation proclamations that his generals had issued, and overturns them. He makes public statements like everybody knew that slaves were the cause of the war. He makes public statements that he would if he could save the Union without ending slavery, he would. He makes these kinds of public statements, and all of these things should have given Black Americans more than enough evidence to not have faith in Lincoln. But Douglas says, even as Lincoln did these things, our hearts believed, even while they ached and bled. Right? They still believed in him. Now, if you go back to that paragraph earlier where he begins this line of speaking, when he says, "Our devotion to Abraham Lincoln is not superior to you of audience," right? The devotion Blacks have to Lincoln is not superior to the devotion white Americans have for Lincoln. I'm starting to question whether he was serious when he said that earlier, because the Black Americans' devotion to Lincoln, according to Douglas, never wavered, even when Lincoln did very little to suggest through his actions that he was going to help them. Right? But all the while, Joseph, who was reading? Joseph, were you reading?
Yes.
You want to skip down to the line? Just keep reading where you were, despite the mist and haze.
Despite the mist and haze that surrounded him, despite the tumult, the hurry, and confusion of the hour, we were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln and to make reasonable allowance for the circumstances of his position. We saw him, measured him, and estimated him, not by stray utterances to injudicious and tedious delegations, who often tried his patience, not by isolated facts torn from their connection, not by any partial and imperfect glimpses caught at inopportune moments, but by a broad survey. In the light of the stern logic of great events, and in view of that divinity which shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will, we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Abraham Lincoln.
Pause for just a second there, Joseph. Thank you. Boom. We came to the conclusion. Now, who's the we again? Black Americans, right? We came to the conclusion. This is beautiful. That I've got to look at it exactly, right? That the hour and the man met, right? One of these rare historical moments when the right man was there at the right time. That's the conclusion we came to, right? Even though he seems slow and unwilling and unpassionate about, slavery, we measured him. We saw him. We made exceptions, reasonable allowances for the circumstances of his position, right? And then you go on and you look at the other stuff that Joseph was reading. We saw and measured him not by stray utterances, injudicious and tedious delegations who tried his patience, not by isolated facts torn from their connection, not by partial and imperfect glimpses at inopportune moments. By the way, who is judging Lincoln by those ways? Does anybody know?
I think Douglas is indirectly
Yeah,
suggesting that.
I'm sorry, Joseph. Somebody else.
I was going to say the exact same thing. He was suggesting that whites were judging Lincoln in these ways.
Yeah, he goes on, and we're running out of time. I apologize, but he does point out how battered Lincoln was by his white countrymen, right? His white citizens, fellow white citizens, as president. None of them thought Lincoln was capable of giving the Union. Really, I mean, some of them did. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but white Americans were constantly blaming Lincoln, berating him, criticizing him. It was never good enough. It was never fast enough, right? As Douglas will point out later in the speech, one white American, some white Americans were saying he's moving too quickly. He's too abolitionist, and another white American says he's not abolitionist enough, right? Lincoln, he was blamed by everybody for everything as president. All the while, he's trying to win a war and preserve the Union to the extent that he can eventually influence and try to bring about the end of this institution of slavery. So it's the white Americans, again, Lincoln. So notice what Douglas is doing. I'm sure you've noticed this, right? He's kind of chastising white Americans here indirectly for the fact that they did not appreciate him during the war while he was alive, and they still don't quite seem to appreciate him. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Somebody wanted to jump in. Joseph, go ahead.
He does so as well in a previous paragraph. I think the paragraph before this, when he suggests that in the abundance, he says, in the abundance of your wealth and in the fullness of your just and patriotic devotion. That's the end of the quote. And then he says, you haven't erected statues for Lincoln yet. You're not doing a good enough job.
He says earlier, ours is no superior devotion to Lincoln. Baloney, it's not, right? I mean, he's being very thoughtful here in how he does this. But if you read this carefully, the way we're doing it, thinking about it, he is pointing out one way in which Black Americans, despite all the ways they were far unequal for the last several decades, right? He's pointing out one way in which Black Americans are superior, and that is in their ability to measure Lincoln's actions and know what he was really trying to do, despite everything else, and to remain devoted to him despite that. Without saying it, I think Douglas is pointing out to white Americans, you need to do the same, right, in a certain way. So sorry, Britta, please go right ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go right ahead, please.
Great. In the beginning of the paragraph that we were just reading, beginning with the part where it says he tarried long in the mountain.
Yes.
Okay. When he tarried long in the mountain, when he strangely told us that we were the cause of the war. So he's saying that Abraham Lincoln said that the blacks were the cause of the war. Am I reading that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is that pointing to a certain speech that Lincoln made or something, or is that just a general?
First inaugural.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. First inaugural. Yeah. Where Lincoln.
Okay.
Yeah. Lincoln says.
I would think
sorry,
he's taking it. It's different to say the slaves are the cause of the war, or is the institution of slavery the cause of the war? And I think that's what Lincoln had said. Not that these slaves are so unruly or they're causing problems. I think he was saying the institution of slavery is evil, and we all know it's the cause of.
Right.
Or was that the second inaugural?
That was the second inaugural, but in the first inaugural, he did talk about the rights of slave states, or his, because this was he argued that he had no intention of violating constitutional rights, right, with regard to the slavery in the slave states. So he did make references to that. There were several other speeches where he said, look, everybody knows. The most famous comes later, as you point out in the second inaugural, but he had made other speeches where he says, look, everybody knows this is about slavery. There would be no war had it not been for slavery. So you're right. I think he's talking about the institution, but I think what Douglas is saying, when slaves, and especially in the South, hear that, if they hear it, right, who are, again, you got to remember, the slaves are cut off from almost everything, right? What they're hearing sort of through gossip, perhaps, as word sort of trickles down to them very slowly in the South, is that Lincoln's blaming them somehow for the war. And to which they might say, well, what did I do to cause the war, right? I mean, so I think it was a misunderstanding, as Douglas's point, right? They heard that and they thought that's strange that he would somehow blame them for the war.
Thank you for that. I really didn't know what to think about that phrase, so
Yes,
that really took a lot. Yeah, I'll make copies of the first and second inaugural speech for my classes too.
Yeah, that's the most famous example too, is the second inaugural, where he says everybody knows one way or another that this institution of slavery is the cause of the war. So good question. So thanks, Britta. And he goes on and he says, look, we had this faith in him that others did not throughout the Civil War, and with a kind of consistency. I was looking for this paragraph.
I'd like to, just while you're looking it up, I think it's almost a little disingenuous of Douglas to be saying this, because he himself had been so critical of Lincoln in those early years before the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's true.
And, so now he's sort of like, oh, no, I wasn't really critical. I really had faith.
Yeah. And so that's perfect. That's a great point. And again, we're over time, and I apologize. I've kept you over and we didn't quite get through the whole speech. But that's where he kind of goes with this, I think, that the paragraph after the one we just read, where he says, though he loved Caesar less than Rome, and the Union was more to him than our freedom and our future, he goes on, he lists all these things that gradually Lincoln started to do, right?
Under his rule.
Yeah, we saw the emancipation of all these, or we saw him do these, what seemed like little things at a time, right? He recognized the Republic of Haiti. For the first time, the United States recognized a black republic in Haiti. I mean, and so he gives all these little steps that Lincoln's taking, and then boom, who can forget, he says, right, that night when we heard the bells ringing when Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And from that point forward, there was no longer any doubt, no doubt at all, right? Not even a smidgen of Lincoln's intentions, Douglas says, right? But Mrs. Richmond, on your point, that's a really good point, because Douglas knew, Douglas was very critical of Lincoln on a number of points. By the way, Lincoln invited Douglas to the White House along with another group, a number of other leaders of the black community to discuss with them emancipation or colonization after emancipation. And Douglas took issue with that and disagreed with him deeply, and persuaded Lincoln that, again, that blacks, once freed blacks in America, would not want to leave America. This was their country, right? But Douglas knew. I'm trying to think what the letter is. Douglas knew that Lincoln was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation he knew that Lincoln was going to do this in the summer of 1862, before he even issued the preliminary one. Wow.
The fascinating thing about Lincoln, the famous line of, if I could free half the slaves and save the Union, I would do it. If I could free all the slaves and save I would do any of these things. That was in response to Horace Greeley's letter challenging him. And at that time, Lincoln had his Emancipation Proclamation draft in his desk.
He did.
He couldn't show it to anyone yet, but who knows? By this time, Douglas probably knows that. He wouldn't have known it at the time.
Yeah. So again, great point. Yeah, that Lincoln, and Horace Greeley publishes this letter from Lincoln in his newspaper, right? He's an abolitionist. And Lincoln says, again, as you say, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would. If I could save the Union by freeing all or some slaves, I would. And a lot of the abolitionists read that and said, oh, see, Lincoln doesn't care about slavery. He just wants to save the Union. He's not going to end slavery. Fred Douglass said, I read that, And I noticed that's the first time Lincoln had ever publicly even suggested that he might free some slaves.
He's making people ready.
Yep, he knew it was coming.
I think too, we have to think of in terms of what are the other white men that Douglas had admired. It had been William Lloyd Garrison. They'd been great friends, and they had broken off in part because Garrison was ready to say, let the North secede. You know, we don't want to be linked with this evil, and then all the slaves would have stayed slaves forever.
Yes.
And
then again, a lot of the more radical white abolitionists in the North were constantly critical of Lincoln, right? I mean, if you haven't seen the Lincoln movie, Spielberg's Lincoln movie, which I love, I absolutely love that movie. It's just beautifully done because you get one of the radical abolitionists in the House. Oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank.
Thaddeus Stevens.
Thaddeus Stevens, yeah, Thaddeus Stevens is one of these guys, and he despises Lincoln for not being a man of principle, right? But so that's the typical view of a lot of these abolitionists. But Douglas comes around, as you say, Mrs. Richmond. You're absolutely right. He comes around and sees that Lincoln is trying to accomplish what he can with regard to emancipation, but in light of the realities, the necessities of keeping white America on his side so that he can also win the war, right?
Right,
So
because if he doesn't win the war, it's all kaput. It's all done.
So for example, why does Lincoln overturn the Emancipation proclamations from Generals Fremont and Hunter, who had issued their own emancipation proclamations freeing the slaves in their military districts early in the war? Lincoln overturned them. And abolitionists said, see, he doesn't care about abolition. Why did Lincoln overturn them? Because he's trying to keep Kentucky, right, the border states, he's trying to keep them in the Union. And he knows as soon as they find out that the Union Army is issuing emancipation proclamations, they're going to secede. They're out, or at least they're not going to. They're going to demand that they be neutral and not support the Union. So you have these political considerations. That's why, by the way, ultimately the really great reason I love this speech, beside the fact that it's so carefully crafted and beautifully written, is that it really reveals that Black American, the view that he presents of how Black Americans thought of Lincoln, it reveals his statesmanship, which is a term reserved only for those who are both excellent in terms of politics, but also men of high principle, right? People of high principle. So Lincoln's statesmanship is revealed in the views that Douglas says Black Americans had of him through all of this. So I've really kept you over late. I apologize. We're 10 minutes over. I apologize. So thoughts or questions, and I've talked too much, unfortunately, tonight. I apologize. Last thoughts or questions, other things you wanted to bring up from this?
I love the imagery where he refers to the African Americans as dark and dusky people responding to the call of Abraham Lincoln. It almost seemed apocalyptic to me because he says, with muskets on their shoulders, eagles on their buttons, timing their high footsteps to liberty, and just the dark and dusky soldiers marching forth.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just struck me that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, again, lost on a lot of us today, but that image alone, by the way, the sight of you just described would strike terror in the hearts of a lot of terror, right? Has anybody seen the movie Glory? There's some great, this is I think a really good Civil War film. Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. Who leads the first brigade, the battle in the Civil War. Colonel Shaw. But there are some great scenes in that film where you can just see how, or they're discussing, I think, in sight of those uniformed dark men, also had the effect not only of, it was not only a symbol of pride for them, but it also had the effect of striking fear, deep fear, into the hearts of Confederate soldiers, some Confederate soldiers. But anyway, good. Other thoughts, questions? general observations before we part ways for this evening?
I have one thing.
Sure.
So I got like halfway through this speech, and then I realized that I could pretty much picture all of his descriptions about Lincoln pretty vividly in my head. So it read a lot like a narrative than I guess sort of traditional speeches I'm used to going over. There's a lot of figurative language in there. It was very nice.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. By the way, Douglas is a great writer. I mean, have you read his narrative of it? I mean, he wrote his own narrative. I don't know,
Yeah, I've read
Carolina,
his first autobiography because I think there were many parts. I only read the first one, but yeah.
Yeah, there were four autobiographies. One is the narrative, which is the shortest version, but he's very good at telling stories. So it's very descriptive. A lot of the imagery has been handed down to us, and it's become part of our sort of the American mind with regard to how we think of Lincoln. So a lot of our memory that we have of Lincoln, actually, I think is due in large part to this speech and to other things that Douglas said about Lincoln. Not singly Douglas, but he's had a large role in creating the American memory, so to speak. So good.
That's pretty interesting.
Other thoughts or questions?
I think this speech also really brings out that Douglas was a really well-educated man. For someone, especially someone raised in slavery, there's about 4 Shakespearean quotes, references, allusions, and then besides lots of biblical ones. It's really
Yes.
a speech anyone would be proud to be able to write.
I wish I could write this well. I know that. But again, you're right, Mrs. Richmond, just reveals not only how well his, writing is a reflection of how well your mind thinks. And that's remarkable in this speech, but he's also clearly well read, as you say, right? Which is equally impressive, even more impressive, as you're suggesting, by the fact that he was initially accused when he made his way north and took up with the abolitionists. A lot of people didn't believe he was as smart as he was. They thought that other abolitionists were writing his speeches and putting words in his mouth because, it's not possible for somebody who grew up as a slave to be that intelligent and thoughtful and well read. That was the prejudice anyway. So Douglas proved them wrong.
I think the speech is also more powerful rhetorically. He does the negative things about Lincoln first.
Oh yeah.
Because if he just said, "Oh, we're here to praise the wonderful Lincoln," it wouldn't have felt like a complex portrayal. It wouldn't have been as powerful. It was because he recognized those shortcomings, those negative things, that it has the power that it does. I mean, it really rises to a crescendo at the end, and it's very moving. But if you just started there, there would have been no movement in the speech.
Yeah. Then we might think of this as what in a modern pejorative sense. It's just rhetoric.
Yeah.
Right. Not rhetoric in the ancient sense, but in the more modern sense of it's just sort of empty praise and flattery. Right. So yeah. But by the way, this is a really good advice for writing papers. And research, and I tell our Ashbrook scholars this as they work on their thesis. They all write a senior thesis. You don't, the best papers and theses are ones in which you start by making the strongest case possible for the other point of view. Right?
Well, that's just what he does.
Yeah, right. So it's really easy to set up what they call a straw man argument. Then you just blow and knock it over and just praise, right? So but if you can make the full and strongest case for the counter arguments or the other points of view, and then come back and make an even stronger case for Lincoln or whatever it is you're arguing, that's a really good accomplishment, big accomplishment, and usually makes for good papers. So, all right, everybody. Well, thanks very much. I've enjoyed it, and again, I'm sorry I went about 15 minutes too long tonight, but that was fun.
Kids past their bedtime.
Well, it's past my bedtime now, but I'm old. Okay, thanks. Look forward to